Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Coaching Conversation. In this series, we're aiming to help business owners, business leaders, and fellow coaches by sharing our experience and the experience of our guests who've coached people all around the world in all of different sectors and industries that you can imagine. So, very little more to say other than please now sit back, relax, and enjoy this edition, and look out for a special offer for our loyal audience at the end of the programme. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Coaching Conversation. Today, I'm joined by Jennie McCarthy, who is a professional qualified mediator for the workplace, and we're going to be talking about the increase in the role of mediation in the workplace. Jennie, welcome to the Coaching Conversation. Could you please let the audience know a bit more about yourself and how you abandoned a career as an employment lawyer to take up mediation?
Hi, well, thanks very much for having me. It's lovely to be here. I have to say, I haven't quite abandoned my employment law career just yet. I'm still doing some of that work, but yeah, just to give you some background of myself and how I've got to where I am. I've been an employment law solicitor for over 25 years, and I've worked predominantly in litigation, so conflict, employment tribunals, sort of conflict situations in the workplace. So that's been my specialism over the 25 years. It's always been a very interesting and very varied job. And I've always worked for employers and employees. So I've got very, very good insight as to how both sides think when there's a conflict and how both sides operate and their kind of motivations. And I've also, because of the work I've done, had a very good insight into conflict generally and how people behave once they're in a conflict situation. But there's part of being an employment litigator that gets quite frustrating because you're always, obviously it's very adversarial, and you usually coming up against a problem when things have already gone, very badly wrong. So I've always been quite fascinated in sort of trying to help parties stay out of litigation, stay out of the employment tribunals. And that's quite a big part of what an employment law solicitor does, to be fair, is we are trying to avoid our clients being in that employment tribunal situation if we can. So I've just gradually become more and more fascinated in tackling these issues from a different angle and qualifying as a mediator instead. Something I did quite a few years ago. Didn't do a great deal with it then, but I've re-qualified a couple of years ago now, and I've been doing it much more formally lately. And but as I said, I do still do some employment law as well. But mediation is quite a big focus of mine now. So, and I very much enjoy it. It's very rewarding.
The mediation, is it primarily around employment disputes or is it commercial disputes? How does it work?
Yeah, so I'm qualified as a civil and commercial mediator, so I can deal with any kind of dispute apart from family law. So anything that comes up, and I do get quite a few queries about things like probate disputes, for example, so wills and various disagreements between parties. I personally, and my colleague as well, who also works with me as a mediator, we do tend to focus more in the workplace and in the business, because I guess that's where we've been hanging around really for such a long time. So most of the mediate, or pretty much all of the mediation I do, it's either workplace disputes or it might be a commercial dispute between kind of business owners or directors of a company. So I am broadly in the workplace, but mediation can happen anywhere. So and it does.
Looking at that sort of more specifically in the workplace,
Mm.
who would be a typical client?
Okay, good question. It could be anybody in theory. It tends to be. I mean, I'll give you some scenarios if it helps. So the kind of
Yeah.
queries that I tend to sort of deal with, or the most recent ones. So, and it's very varied. So it tends to be the business owners, all the sort of directors that are likely to engage me, and it tends to be if there's a dispute in the workplace between staff or employees, or between an employee and the employer. So I do tend to get engaged by the company more often than not if it's a workplace dispute. However, I have been contacted by individuals in the past as well. And one particular example, an individual employee contacted me to tell me, when I was in my role as an employment law solicitor, to tell me they wanted to bring a claim against their employer. I identified that mediation might be more appropriate, and I approached the company and said, "Are you interested in engaging in mediation with this person?" And to their credit, they said yes. And also, as I say, when it's a commercial dispute, it tends to be the business owners that will get in touch with me and say that there's an issue here. So that's who I tend to get engaged by. I mean, as I say, if you want me to, I can sort of talk through a bit more examples of the kind of disputes. Is that helpful? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I was just having a think at my sort of most latest mediations that I've been working on, and this probably shows you the variety, really, of the kind of things I've been working with. So, one of the disputes, one of the clients I'm still working with now is two people that run an organisation together, and there's some problems really that they just can't really get to the bottom of themselves. They're not in conflict as such, but they're struggling to grapple with some issues that have become quite historic and are still ongoing. So they've contacted me jointly to ask me to mediate between them. There's one, as I say, this one where the employee contacted me and we did a mediation together. I guess I should explain what mediation is, which I'll do in just a second as well, because I guess I've not talked about that yet. So again, I came in on that one to help resolve that issue with that employee and his employer. There's one where we've had an employment tribunal claim, which was quite far on, and also a county court claim that was attached to the same issues, where I've mediated to resolve that dispute. So it's quite far on. And that's where both people jointly instructed me to mediate between them. And then there's been a couple where it is simply two employees not getting on, and it's got to a point where they just don't seem to be able to resolve it, and I've come in and assisted with that. So as you can see, it's quite varied really in terms of when I get involved.
Is it usually an individual and the company, or two individuals, or can it be groups of people in dispute?
It can be groups of people in dispute. I personally haven't worked with groups of people in dispute so far, and he works with people where it tends to be either, like I say, the individual against the company, which obviously you could say is a group of people, I guess, but it's sort of the individual not happy with the organisation, or it tends to be just two people that are in dispute with each other. But it can be more than two people. Shall I just explain a little bit about just what mediation actually is?
Please do. I think it'd be really helpful.
Because I'm conscious that I've not done that yet. Because I think a lot of people don't know what it is, or don't really understand, what mediation is for. And in essence, it's a voluntary, informal process where an independent person can come in and help parties try and resolve any dispute or issue that they've got going on between them. So it's completely confidential. As I say, it's completely voluntary, so no one has to get involved if they don't want to. And it's a mechanism where I will sit with the parties and I will just help to facilitate a conversation and facilitate them hopefully understanding each other's position, and hopefully being able to find a way through the issues that have come up. So it's a very flexible process, and no two mediations are the same in terms of how I conduct them or what the issues are, because I'm very guided by my clients' needs and what the issue is, and I'm very happy to kind of do it in whatever way they feel is suitable for them. So as I say, it's a way of kind of facilitating discussions and trying to facilitate an outcome. Whatever we agree, I can't force any decisions on anybody. I can't make people do anything they don't want to do. And I don't reveal anything confidential that I'm told in any individual meetings unless I've got permission to do so. So it's a chance for people to really kind of let rip, I guess, and say exactly what they think privately to me. But because I'm meeting them, because I'm talking to them both, sometimes together, sometimes independently, they do really feel like they can really say what they think. And then through that process, I can usually help each party understand the other side's position and sort of help them find a way forward.
Why do you think there is an uptick in the use of mediation in the workplace? Is there some background to that?
I think people are starting to become more aware of it, and I think people are just starting to. I don't think people really have understood what it was, or even known about it until fairly recently. That's my perception, and I guess I've got quite a good insight into that because my background as an employment lawyer. I think the reason why people are becoming more aware of it is partly because the courts are now, well, certainly the court process. From my understanding, there's a compulsion that people have to go through mediation before they can issue court proceedings. My specialism is in the employment tribunal, so it's a little different there. There's not a compulsion, but even the employment tribunals have now brought in a judicial mediation. So that's, I think it's just become more on people's radar that's something that exists. And as I say, I just think there's more of an awareness, and I hope that people are starting to see that it's actually a very cost-effective and highly effective way of resolving disputes. So I think HR managers and directors seem to be more aware of it now as a really useful mechanism to try and resolve things. And to resolve them early, because that's the thing about mediation, is that if you can get in there fairly early, hopefully it stops a problem escalating. So the answer to your questions, I think it's purely about awareness and people just appreciating what it is and how useful it is.
And when you talk about the success rate, if you look back on the cases that you've mediated,
Yeah,
how many, as a percentage of 100 or
yeah.
10, would you say had resulted in a successful meeting of minds?
Okay, that's a really good question because obviously we have to define what success is. To be absolutely honest, I would say all of the mediations I've done in the last couple of years have had some level of success. Now, that sounds a bit woolly because you might say, well, what does that mean and how do you know? But some of them have resulted in a signed agreement. So the one, for example, that was the employment tribunal claim, that resulted in an agreed settlement of that claim. Interestingly, not on the day itself. On the day itself, it all broke down and everyone walked away. And this was a Friday, but on the Monday, then the parties then decided to come to an agreement. So that's the interesting thing about mediation. Sometimes you don't necessarily get the outcome on that day, but it makes everyone think. So sometimes we have had that absolute, signed agreement. Other times, and a few times we've had that. Again, in the one where the employee contacted me, we had I'll digress into that story in a minute, actually, because that was quite interesting. Other times, like the one I'm working on a regular basis, we're not really trying to achieve any kind of agreement. My clients are using mediation there as a way of just being able to air their issues and their disputes. So they feel that's very successful to them because it gives them the opportunity, if you like, to sort of have their arguments in a safe environment where it's facilitated by me. So I would like to say that's successful, but we haven't actually done any work to come to any agreement, but they tell me that it's useful for them to be able to sort of go through their issues together. So my short answer is I think they're all successful to some extent because what it does is it allows both sides to at least see the other person's point of view, and it allows them to understand that point of view. But I'd say, in terms of actual an agreement or a meeting of minds, very, very high success rate. It's very different in each case, and I'm very aware I've not given you a concrete answer there, but it's very difficult to say.
But as you say, if you've got to a situation where they're rumbling along together when they
Yes.
weren't previously, that is success, isn't it?
Exactly, and that's what I mean. I think it's success is quite hard to define, but in the example of the two people that I work with on a regular basis, when they came to me, they were at the point where the relationship was about to break down. That was how it was reported to me, and it's interesting because we talk about communication and we talk about perhaps having some of these conversations together, and they say to me, we don't feel like we can do that. We'd rather do that with you. So they kind of store their disagreements now, and they sort of meet me every 6 weeks and have a big old row for a few hours, and then off they go and they carry on working together. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a win because they're still able to work with
Absolutely
each
it
other.
is. Yeah, I can see that, and I think the safe space area is the important piece there, isn't it?
Absolutely.
They can do it, and they can
Absolutely.
say what they need to say and feel they've had their two payoff. Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah. And also, I can help reframe some of the things that they do say. So,
yeah,
that I mean, I'm sure you agree with your coaching. One of the major problems I feel that leads to conflict is communication, and it's communication and how things are voiced, and it's also when people don't feel like they're being heard or
yeah.
don't feel like they're being listened to. So, in terms of my role as a mediator, when people are sort of letting off steam about how they feel, it's very powerful when it's reframed in a slightly different way, and it makes the listener understand more. So it's not only a safe space, but it's also hopefully helping them break down some of the sort of trigger points, I guess, and just helping them communicate more effectively in the future.
Looking wider at the organisation generally, do you find there are any specific aspects of the size of an organisation or the kind of culture of an organisation that impacts the suitability of mediation?
Not at all. No, I don't think that's the case at all, especially because mediation tends to be a fairly contained issue within that organization. So, for example, if you've got a very, very large organization, usually when someone approaches me about mediation, it's because of a particular person has a particular dispute, either with them or with another team member. So really, it's a kind of micro issue that I'm normally
Yeah.
dealing with within the organization. So it doesn't make any difference to me, or it hasn't done in any mediations I've done so far, how big the organization is. I think there's sometimes where there's a conflict and it might be two employees that are not getting on, and that is having a knock-on effect on other people in the
Yeah.
organization as
Yeah.
well. But again, the size of the organization doesn't seem to be an issue. One thing I've not done myself, as I say, is kind of mediate on sort of mass disputes like trade union disputes or anything like that. So I guess in that scenario, that might make things different if it was if I
Yeah.
was kind of mediating in that, but that's not something I've personally done.
So for those of us who've not been through a mediation
Yeah.
process, what are the steps? How does
Okay.
a typical engagement work?
Yeah. What does it look like normally?
Yeah.
So again, always flexible. And again, quite a lot of the ones I've done can be very different. But the sort of textbook, if you like, the way the mediation normally works is one party will approach me to talk to me about the fact that they would like mediation to happen. I will then, because mediation is voluntary and there's no point unless the other person is willing to engage, I will contact the other person or party just to check whether it's something that they want to be involved in at all and check that they understand what it is. Once we've got both people on board, I will usually send out just some terms of reference just to remind people it's confidential, it's impartial, it's without prejudice, and just to make sure they realise everything. We need to be courteous and some ground rules. Then sometimes I will ask both parties to send me just a sort of one-page summary of where they're at and what the situation is for them, because I think it's quite helpful. And also not just me, sorry, to send it to the other person as well. So sometimes I'll get people to do that in advance of the mediation itself, which I think is quite helpful then, because both people know where the other person's coming from, and also it helps me as a background of what's happening. Then, when the mediation itself takes place, what I normally do is have a meeting between both people together initially, where they'll then both talk through again, really what they've already put in their statement, and just talk through to me where they're at and how they're feeling. I usually keep that fairly short initially, and then we'll break up and separate everybody, and I will then flip between the two parties to talk to them confidentially. And that's very powerful because that's when they really tell me exactly what they're thinking. And it's very important for me to stress in those meetings that whatever they tell me is completely confidential, and I won't reveal it to the other person unless they do specifically give me permission to do so. And that's why mediation is such a useful process, because, as I say, they can really talk to me and tell me exactly what they're thinking. So I will tend to go between the two different parties as many times as I need to. Sometimes I'll bring them together again, sometimes I'll separate them again. So it's very flexible in terms of how I do things. But usually throughout the session, I do have permission to then talk to the other person about some of the things that have been said. And I can obviously, because I'm gathering from both sides where they're at, I can usually start teasing out where I can see there's things that could be agreed on. So once we've done all of that, hopefully we then come together and we then try and agree ways forward based on what we've done throughout the session. So that's the normal. I know that's very, very brief, but that's normally how it works. However, there's been mediations where I've literally just had phone calls between two different people that have gone on over the space of a few weeks as well. So it can be very flexible in terms of how I deal with it, depending on what their needs
The
are.
outline that you gave us for, say, a textbook
Yeah,
version,
yeah.
would that last one day or be spread over several days or weeks? How would that
Good
normally?
question. Yeah, the way I personally feel is normally more helpful is it's usually half a day at a time. That's usually enough. The mediation where we were dealing with mediating on an existing tribunal and court claim that lasted for a whole day. That was quite intense because it was factually very. There was a lot to it. But most mediations have tended to be half a day because I find that's enough really initially to sort of air the issues and go through the issues and talk to both parties. If it can't be resolved in that day, or if it feels like there's more work to be done, I would sometimes recommend a follow-up session, another half day, another time. But on the whole, they don't tend to need more than that because it tends to, again, it's that kind of helpful that it usually just a half day or a couple of half days is enough to air the issues and start resolving them. So yeah, it's usually fairly short and sharp.
And whilst it's impartial, how do you try to avoid becoming judgmental?
Yeah, that can be a challenge at times, especially because I'm a trained solicitor. So in my job as a solicitor, it's my job to take sides and represent one person. So it's quite a shift to not do that. I'm only human. Sometimes I do have thoughts and opinions where I think someone perhaps might not be being completely reasonable or realistic in their view. But the answer is I never express any opinions of that nature, and I would never. It's so important that I am completely impartial and that no one thinks that I'm taking sides because that would be the whole thing would break down. So in my mind, sometimes I guess I probably do feel a little bit judgmental, for want of a better word. If I feel like someone's not being realistic, the way I deal with that is I will just sort of try and sense check with them the position they're in and just talk through in a way that hopefully isn't sounding confrontational to just talk through their position, sometimes try and reframe that if I feel like it's the framing that's a problem, or just sometimes do a reality check. So if someone, for example, is insisting that they want £100,000 as compensation, I might just go through and say, okay, well, let's just break that down. How have we got to that figure? And if this was to go to a tribunal instead, let's look at, what you might be able to come out with and just try and break down, I guess, their position. But the thing I have to remember, and again, the essence of conflict is when people take a position or when they have an opinion about something, unless they're particularly manipulative, that's usually their truth. That's how they genuinely feel. So I don't feel like I'm judgmental about that because I have to appreciate that that's how they are genuinely feeling at that time. But hopefully what I can do is just work with them to perhaps help them understand it from a different point of view or help them understand the other side's point of view. So yeah, it's I have to be very careful, and I'm only human. Sometimes I do think, well, that doesn't seem particularly reasonable, but I obviously am very, very careful not to express that.
And when you've reached an agreement, and you
Hmm.
mentioned, or I gave the example of one where they hadn't reached an agreement on a Friday
Yeah,
night, come Monday, they had
yeah,
second thoughts and came
hmm,
to an agreement. Do
yeah.
you find agreements stick rather
Uh,
than get sort of turned over or the coals raked over months, weeks later?
Yeah, good question. So that I guess there's different types of agreement as well. So, for example, the one that did settle then on the Monday morning, because that was part of a employment tribunal claim, what the parties then did is then they with the help of ACAS, who would be the person, ACAS would always help to draw up an agreement in a tribunal claim, which makes it a legally binding settlement. So they then as a mediator, what I should say, as a mediator, I don't draft an agreement. So when people do come to an agreement, I would never write that agreement for them. That's their job to write it together. Now, if I'm there still, I'll obviously help them with that, and I'll help them sort of sense check what goes in there. But the agreement has to be theirs. So with the example of the tribunal claim, they then went ahead and did that through ACAS and got a binding settlement, which was a contract. So yes, that will stick because it's binding. And if it didn't, then there'd be, that one of them would be able to sue the other for breach of contract. In other agreements where there's a dispute between two employees, for example, we wouldn't, of course, make them sign a contract, but we might just sort of have a kind of a terms of reference or an agreement going forward. So, and it's just sort of, it has to be fairly broad about, from now on, I will try not to upset you by doing X or whatever. So far as I know, they've stuck, and no one's come back to me and told me that it hasn't. But I think it's more of a kind of understanding of each person's point of view, and it's more of an agreement that they will take more consideration as to how the other person feels in certain situations. So I don't know if I've answered that question really. It's a bit vague really, but I think
no,
general,
I think you
yes.
did. I think, yeah, very comfortable with that. Just on a technical point, what's the
Mhm.
difference between mediation and arbitration?
Okay, so mediation is it is an informal voluntary process, and a mediator is there just to help facilitate an agreement and to help facilitate the parties come to an agreed outcome. With arbitration, that's more of a binding process where there is an arbitrator that can force a decision on the parties, and therefore they are then bound by that decision. So it's almost like an arbitration is like an in between, really, sort of just below a court process. And a lot of contracts for various things will have an arbitration clause in there that people have to go to arbitration before they go to court. So the difference is that mediation is completely informal, completely voluntary, and I, as a mediator, can't force anyone to come to any kind of agreement or decision that they're not happy with.
And now that you're in this role more and more and increasingly moving away from employment law,
Mm-hmm.
what gives you the greatest satisfaction?
Oh, yeah, there's lots of things. I mean, just being able to try and help conflict get resolved at an earlier stage rather than being in litigation. It's just as on a human level, it's just so much more satisfactory than watching people sort of fight through the employment tribunal system, because that's no good for anybody. It's financially draining, it's exhausting, it's time consuming. So the satisfaction of what I'm effectively doing is most of the time hopefully stopping that happening at all, by resolving things before they get that far. Or even if they have got that far, I'm helping parties get to a resolution rather than going on to the tribunal. So just on a broad answer is just helping that process, really, of helping avoid litigation between parties. I think on a day-to-day, as I say, conflict is all about communication, and it's all about, well, usually, and it's all about people not feeling heard. And for me, it gives me such a satisfaction when I can just see, I can tell when I come into mediation, I can often see exactly what's gone wrong. It's clear to me as an outsider and someone that's used to watching people in conflict what the issue is. But obviously, it's not my job to come in and say, well, this is what you need to do. Well, this is what you're doing wrong. But I get a great satisfaction when I see the penny dropping, from both sides as to what's going on and perhaps what could be done differently from either side to sort of help things go forward. So and just being able to facilitate that, it's just hugely rewarding to sort of help people then move forward and sort of break out of the cycle of that conflict. So yeah, so on several levels, it's very, very satisfying.
Jenny, thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing your experience as a mediator. If any of the audience want to know more, where can they find you?
So the company that I have set up with a colleague of mine, it's called Mint Mediation. So if they want to email me, they can email me on info at Mint Mediation, or they can Google the website, which is still a bit of a work in progress, I have to confess. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I think I'm just on as Jennifer McCarthy, but hopefully you'd be able to find me. I'm not very good at social media apart from that, I'm afraid. So it's probably the best way is to either email me or find me on LinkedIn. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions about mediation or to just have a chat generally, because it's a subject I am very passionate about.
Jenny, thanks for your time. That's it for this edition, and we'll see you again next time. So there you have it, the latest edition of the Coaching Conversation. Hope you enjoyed it, that you found it useful, and I hope it did what it set out to do. As promised at the beginning of the programme, here is a special offer for you, our loyal audience. If you reach out to me at gwiley@sagegreen.com and mention this podcast, we'll make available to you a coaching programme for you and or your team at a 50% discount. So where can you reach us? So it's definitely gwiley@sagegreen.com. You can also reach us at the Executive Mindset at sagegreen.com, and our website is clearly theexecutivemindset.co.uk. If you enjoyed this, do please leave us with a wonderful rating on Google. We'd really appreciate that. So nothing more for me to say now other than see you again soon.